The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Again, what I love about the concept of nostalgia is that just the idea of homesickness, the idea that there's something distorted about memory, there's something distorted about the distance of time. We fool ourselves into thinking, like, it's that temptation to go back, right? If we could just get back to these certain things, if we could just have that one conversation, you can make things right again. And reality always disappoints on that front.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Mike Cosper is the director of podcasting for Christianity Today, where he hosts The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill and Cultivated, a podcast about faith and work. He's the author of several books, most recently Land of My Sojourn, The Landscape of a Faith Lost and Found. Mike Cosper, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast. Thanks for making time for me.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm super honored to be here.
Yeah, so, okay, your new book is Land of My Sojourn. Can you just give me the quick summary? When you summarize this book, people ask you what your book's about. What's the short version?
The version the way I've started telling it, because it's about several things, right? It's one of these books there's several different themes that kind of wind together, but the core of it is the idea that disillusionment and broken dreams are a normal part of the Christian life. Mm. And I didn't know that. I wasn't prepared for that. And I think most of us aren't. I think that's why we call it disillusionment and broken dreams. So when it happened to me, I thought I was losing my faith and so much wasn't making sense anymore. But through the process, through a real grace-filled process, a real painful process, I came to sort of reconcile with faith, but also to recognize the ways that my faith, that my disillusionment itself, my broken dreams are part of a reflection of the biblical story of what it means to follow Jesus and to pursue life with God.
Yeah. Your subtitle includes the word lost faith, right? Remember the phrase faith lost and found? Or
yeah, the landscape of a faith lost and found.
Yeah. But when I read the book, I didn't see evidence of lost faith. Did I miss something?
No, I mean, I never renounced my faith. I never, it's not like a full blown, it's not like a full blown rejection of faith. I like the language of lost faith though, because what certainly happened was I sort of woke up one day going, none of this makes sense anymore. Mm-hmm. Faith as I understood it fell apart for me. Some of that was because of what I anticipated was God's call in my life and God's purpose for my life, kind of rerouting at midlife. Some of it was things that I was observing in my community around me as well, of people where I thought like, hey, I thought we were on the same page. I thought we were about the same things for the kingdom of God, et cetera, et cetera. And kind of discovering like, no, I don't think we're all playing the same game at all. And so in the sense of it being lost, like it's as much about me sort of being lost in this place where, like, one metaphor I use at one point in the book is the idea that like gravity just sort of switches off and you suddenly sort of find yourself floating. You don't know what's up. You don't know what's down. And it's incredibly disorienting, which is another word I think shows up quite a lot in the book.
And I guess, I mean, when you say there was a faith lost, you lost a faith, right? You had a story that you were holding on to that you let go of. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that part of the lesson learned for me is that that's a normal crossroads. I think for many of us in the Christian life, we carry a certain set of expectations. We create a certain set of expectations for what faith is, and for what faithful, what's going to come from faithful living. Mm-hmm. And those things turn out not to be true, or when we discover that they're projections and we discover that reality is a little uglier than we'd hoped. That's a painful process.
Yeah. In this podcast, I end up talking a lot about the power of story, the power of metaphor, that kind of thing. And in many ways, this is a book about the ways that we misuse story and metaphor, and the ways that we, hold tightly to a story, even as it starts to catch on fire. Or as I sometimes say, clutching to it like a drowning man clutching to a cinder block. And so, let's talk about this idea of the way story gets misused in our lives, or and also, I love that idea of the stories we cling to, even as they we realize are not true.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in terms of, for me personally, a big part of the book is, there's sort of these two streams of storytelling in the book. One of them's my story, and then one of them is this series of reflections on some biblical stories. And for me, I had a real sense that I was part of this. So I was a pastor in a church for 15 years, helped plant the church, helped it grow through these, kind of remarkable seasons of growth. And people who may have known my work from the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, like the story of my church will sound very familiar. It's very similar. Big multi-site church, and lots of problems towards the end of my time there as well. For me, because the experience was so good and so rich at the beginning, and it was such a beautiful and life-shaping experience in so many ways. What I clung to was the idea that we had figured something out, right? Like that we had unlocked a way of doing church, of being community, that, naively, like, you put it, again, hindsight makes you, even saying these things, like, you feel foolish, but you look at it and you go, well, we had just figured something out that, like, our parents and our other churches and stuff, like they went through hard times and they had divisions and all of this, but we've really figured it out, like.
By the way, would you have said that out loud at that time?
I don't, certainly not. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have put it that flatly, but I think it was there. I mean, I think if I'm being honest, in hindsight, that idea was there in there.
Yeah.
The idea, for certain, we had the idea that, like, we'd embraced a kind of authenticity, which is, I think, what we convinced ourselves was like, gave us the immunity we needed from problems. We're so authentic. We know how to work through conflict. We're committed to community in these new and different ways and all of this. So I think it was there, but I don't think certainly wouldn't have said it that way. But yeah, so because it was so good at the beginning, when it started to go bad, what I found was that I kept looking for ways to frame the present such that the problems could be ignored, stuffed down, tolerated, shouldered, for the sake of the idea that like ultimately this thing that we believe in matters so much that it's worth the trouble, it's worth the heartache, it's worth the collateral damage, which in an unhealthy church is a real part of it.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned more than once in your book is that you were telling yourself that you were always one healthy conversation, one good conversation away from health, I think is the way you put it.
Yeah. I got that. Actually, I got that phrase. I think I mentioned this in the book, but I got that phrase from Tim Smith from Mars Hill. That was a comment he made. And yeah, you really do feel that way. I mean, and that's something I think anybody who's been inside an unhealthy community will agree with, because nobody stays in these communities because you're just plain stuck. Like church just doesn't work that way. Certainly not in North America. I mean, there are cults that work that way and all of that. But you stay in churches that are that way because there are these incredibly powerful bonds that connect you to one another. And part of it's vision, and part of it is your sense of identity of who you are and who you're becoming. And you particularly end up having, like, I think for me, part of it too was like I had this picture of, this is who I'm going to be when I'm 40 and I'm still here, or when I'm 50 and I'm still here, what my family's going to look like, and all the rest. And so the idea is I can bear the pain of this through this season, because I know that eventually we'll work it out. And when we work it out, it's going to have been worth it. It's going to be really good. At some point you look back and you go, the season has been like 3 years.
Yeah.
It's not, I don't think it's letting up anytime soon. And that's when you have to start reevaluating.
Yeah. I kept thinking as I was reading your story about the ways that we tell ourselves these stories that we think somehow we don't acknowledge that this is a story I made up. And then somehow I feel like I am owed the ending, or not just the ending, even the middle that I've composed in this story.
Mm-hmm.
And there are stories that help us align with reality. And then there are stories that give us ways to not align with reality. And I want to return to the idea of reality in a little while, because you said something about grief that I thought was incredibly helpful. But anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. You make the observation at one point that we have this tendency to make Jesus a character in our own story.
Mm-hmm.
And then and you say, if that's what we want, to make Jesus a character in our story, the real Jesus will disappoint us every time.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I want to use the story of Jesus overturning the tables as a way to justify my own tendency toward angry outbursts, when I do encounter the real Jesus, it's a bit of a letdown. He's not always turning over tables. He did that just, there's one account of him turning over the tables, but just one.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's all this business about turning the other cheek that I, am not as interested in that part of the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess that's not a question, but
no. But I think it's an important point. So much of the way we do church, and again, like so much of the way I even think through discipleship, is through the lens of having been a pastor in a church that was part of kind of the contemporary evangelical church growth thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's so mechanistic and it's so transactional that it becomes really hard to think of Jesus outside of those terms.
I'm sorry, what is mechanistic and transactional?
The way we think about faith, the way we think about faith, and the way we think about the way that we think about church. Because what we're trained to do, like the way, like the at the heart of a lot of like the way church growth works. And again, there are exceptions to every rule, blah blah blah, caveat emptor, right? But the way, the way the church growth thing often functions is that we look at the world and we go, okay, there is a there are it's like anything else in life where there's a formula, right?
Uh-huh.
So if you want to lose weight, what you got to figure out is like, what's the formula? Like I burn more calories than you take in, or it's actually not calories, it's protein, or it's what, all that kind of stuff. Like life is about looking for like, what's the key? What's the idea that if I just sort of lock this thing in, it's going to sort of solve everything else. And the way we do church often functions that way. We're looking for this idea that we go, man, if we figure out this one little piece and we just implement it rightly, like the utopia is coming on the other side of that. We're going to reach the city. We're going to change the world. We're going to, reach everybody for Jesus and all of that. And of course, like ultimately, like that's it's almost like, I'm not calling it witchcraft, but it's almost like witchcraft, right? Like it's like you're doing it some sort of incantation or whatever. And the idea is that if I perform my part of this ritual or this incantation, God has to do what I want him to do on the other side of it. And so if I am embodying a certain kind of masculinity, or if I'm embodying a certain kind of role as a pastor or whatever it is, then God owes me the good life on the other side of it. And when suffering comes because someone in that I love is dealing with sin, or they're dealing with suffering, or they get taken from me, or whatever the circumstance is, like all of a sudden the transaction doesn't make sense anymore. Like the equation doesn't add up anymore. And for a lot of us, what it does is it sends us just looking for another transaction, like another equation. Oh, I must have gotten the math wrong.
I was doing the wrong kind of math.
Yeah. And in reality, what it's waking us up to is that, like, I love Dallas Willard's language that, God is a person, right? And when you start to think of God as a person, or God as the three persons of the Trinity, and you start thinking in terms of person and personality and all of this, this idea of like no transactional relationship in your life is actually that important or meaningful to you. The meaningful ones are complicated, and they're messy, and they're unpredictable. And certainly one where you're dealing with somebody who's as authoritative and important as God. The idea that praying the right things or embodying the right kind of persona somehow leaves him indebted to you. It just it's bizarre. But it's how we think about these things. It's how we're trained to think about these things. It's hard to break out of it.
I mean, think about the ways that transactions relieve us of the need for gratitude, for instance. When I buy a hamburger, I might say thank you to the person who sold it to me, but I don't really mean it. I mean, the whole point is I gave you some money, you gave me a hamburger, we're square. And I might be polite and say thank you, but gratitude doesn't really enter into it. And that transaction frees me from the personal entanglements involved. I'm not entangled with a person, the server at the restaurant, in the way that I'm entangled with my wife, when we serve each other a meal.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I mean, what's so interesting about the story of the Bible is that you have all these accounts of people who, like, the Bible is very unambiguous about the fact that God is like way more powerful and way more mysterious, and it's a very lopsided relationship in a lot of ways. But you also have, like, especially in the Old Testament, like, you have all of these characters who have this just sort of brash willingness to sort of tangle with God on his terms. And what's great about it is that they know it's not transactional, right? And sometimes they'll argue on those terms. And in fact, the reason Job's friends get so rebuked by God at the end of it is because they argue that, hey, there's a transactional thing going on here, and you've clearly screwed something up, and this is why God's mad at you and all of this. And Job's like, no, it's not that, because I didn't do anything wrong. Weirdly, God shows up and kind of defends him and says, no, you didn't do anything wrong, but guess what? I still don't owe you anything, I think I lost my train of thought on that. Oh, what I was going to say is I do think it's interesting that, in spite of the fact that the relationship is profoundly lopsided, like there's also this I guess we just call it a mercy of God that that he sort of still sets the table for us to just come in and speak our minds like we belong. Like that's the part of it that, whether it's the book of Hebrews talking about boldly entering in, or, Paul talking about addressing him as Abba Father, or like Jacob complaining and wrestling and manipulating and lying and all these things to try and sort of reckon with God on all of that. All of that's way more interesting and way more complicated than, here are 5 principles for a godly life, and if you do these things, God will get you what you want. You can do all those things and never encounter the person of God, which is a far more interesting way to live.
Yeah. You mentioned that when Peter is denying Christ, he first he says, I don't know, when the people say, I think I think I saw you with Jesus. He says, I don't know what you're talking about. And you say, obviously that's a lie. And then he says, I don't know the man, which seems like an escalation of the lie, but you suggest actually maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe he really does mean, I don't know. I thought I knew the man. Turns out I didn't know the man, because I had this idea of who he was going to be and what he was up to. Turns out he was up to something else, and I don't know the man. And again, I think we're back on stories, and we have these stories that we tell about who we are, who God is, what's our place in the universe. And when that story turns out to be not the story we thought, when the true story turns out to be different, the idea, I don't know the man, turns out to be truer than we thought.
Yeah. I came at that, it's funny. It's a part of the book that I'm interested, as we're talking here, the book's 2 or 3 weeks away from coming out. I'm interested in how people react to that section, because it's a novel reading, and I acknowledge that, right? like I know there are people who are going to be, well, literally, and I get that, but I came to it just thinking about the nature of denial, and some of this was just thinking about that story after my own experiences of grief, of losing my dad, and of other experiences, other encounters with grief that were very life-changing for me over the last few years. And thinking about denial as something that is this, in terms of the way we often experience denial, it's a reflexive emotion. It's a reflexive experience far more than it's a sort of cognitive experience, because fundamentally, like the way that story is taught most of the time, it's what it's saying is, like, Peter's great sin is not simply that he's denying Jesus. It's that, like, Peter is a liar, right? Like, that's the fundamental, the fundamental thing that's going on there. He's lying to all these people and saying he's not who they think he is. And as I thought about that story, like one of the reasons that account doesn't entirely make sense to me is that Peter wasn't afraid of violence. He wasn't afraid to die. He was the one in the garden that pulled his sword and was ready to go to war. But what I'm thinking about is that, Peter, he sees Jesus descend from the Mount of Olives and like the king riding into the city to take his throne. He's anticipating this installation of a Davidic kingdom that's going to conquer the whole earth, and they're going to have all these thrones. All these things that have felt promised to him for all these years are sort of crumbling in front of him. And to me, like, denial in that sense, denial as this sort of psychological reflex of going, I don't even know who this guy is anymore, right? Like, that kind of denial makes a whole lot more sense than simply this kind of Peter being just reflexive and fearful and lying to people so that to sort of save his own skin. It doesn't entirely make sense to me. Now, again, there are those versions, but there's a way to tell that story that I think does make sense. I will say this: the way I've heard the passage taught more than any other is this sort of proto-apocalyptic, what will you do when you're put in the spot
Yeah.
to deny Jesus, right?
Yeah.
A group of gunmen storm into the room right now before the sermon ends, and they say, who will stand with Jesus and die, and who will whatever, like who's going to deny the faith in those moments? And like, again, like back to stories, right? Like that way of telling that story once again puts you in the role of the hero. It's a very narcissistic way to think about that story. That Peter's denial is ultimately about how great we are. It's an example for us to be better and greater and all of these things. I think, I think Peter's denial is much more sort of an illustration of what happens when what we expect crashes into reality and we don't know how to make sense of it anymore. Yeah. And yes, what he said was fundamentally untrue. Like, he did, of course, know Jesus, but also there was this reality to it of him going, he probably would have just as easily said, I don't think I know anything anymore.
No, the idea that moment, again, I'm not, there's no reason for us to, try to overturn this many centuries of
Sure.
the reading of that story, but that insight that maybe this is a moment where he actually was not getting farther away from Jesus, but getting closer.
Mm-hmm.
Just to acknowledge, I thought I knew and now I don't.
Mm-hmm.
If that were what he was doing, that's a pretty remarkable thing. I mean, you say at one point, and this is one of my favorite things from the book, something's going to stay with me for a long time. You say grief is not the need to sit around and feel bad for a little while, which I think is maybe a way you've joked about grief before, but grief is an encounter with reality. And that when you can come to terms with the reality that things have changed, or maybe things aren't what you thought they were, that encounter with reality is the essence of grief, and it's what makes it possible for us to go on.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, that's a Peter saying, I don't know the man, is the beginning of grief that can be very healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I come to that in the book because there's this, there was this long period of my life after leaving ministry and after feeling like so many of my, my sense of what my future was supposed to look like, after watching that all kind of crumble, I spent a lot of time and a lot of money sitting on therapist couches, trying to sort those things out, and had a lot of them telling me, hey, you need to learn to grieve. Like, you need to grieve this. Mm-hmm. And I would just write it down in my little notebook and take it home and, and not know what to do with it. And yeah, it was the loss of my father was one of these moments that, I mean, death is so final, in a certain sense. Like, death is so sort of existentially final, like on this side of the resurrection.
Sure.
That denial certainly has its limits. And I think for a lot of people who have been in, even people who've been in like deeply spiritually abusive environments and spiritually abusive church communities, or relationships or whatnot, like, there's still that piece of you that clings to the part of it that was good, and it clings to the part of it that gave you meaning and purpose, or connected you to community with other people, and that you hold on to that, and you think, under the right conditions, if this thing came together and that thing came together and that person, took responsibility and that person stopped enabling, or whatever it was, like whatever that laundry list was, those things could kind of all come together, and we could get it back to the way that it used to be.
And get the band back together.
I mean, literally making that joke, right? And again, like with the death of my father, like, was this realization that like, nothing, like, I'm never going to be able to pick up my phone again and text my dad when something makes me laugh, or I'll think something's gonna make him laugh or whatever. And I think there's something about that with those kinds of experiences in life too, that I wasn't ready to let those things go. Like that that sense of getting the band back together was always there. Under the right conditions, I could get those moments back that were so good and that mattered so much to me. And it sort of took learning from actual death, to learn to grieve the loss of certain experiences and the loss of certain possibilities, because you don't lose the whole experience. Like, the memories are there and those still matter, and they're a mess, and they're a mess because of the negative things you experienced, but they're still there. Grief is the necessary process of saying it's time to move on and let that part of my life, die, go to seed.
Yeah. Could you make the connection between cognitive dissonance, that sort of the way that you live in a unhealthy organization, say, in an unhealthy relationship, thinking I'm one good conversation away from health, that cognitive dissonance on the one hand, and then grief, using your definition of encountering reality, be really helpful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, well, and funnily enough, I mean, there you come back to denial, right? Because there's an aspect of denial that's essential in order to maintain that cognitive dissonance for so long.
Yeah.
Like, you have to, somewhere in your life, and this is something I've seen a lot with people who come out of unhealthy communities. Like, somewhere in your life, someone's paying the price for an abusive leader's, a problematic leader's sins. It might be you, because you're internalizing it and you're carrying the weight of reconciling conflicts and managing people and managing the downstream consequences. It might be your family, because they've lost you, because you belong entirely to that church or that community or whatever it may be. It may be other staff. You could go on and on. Like, somewhere somebody's paying the price for all of that. And I genuinely believe inside most unhealthy spiritual communities are very well-intended people and deeply committed people of faith, trying their best to figure out how do we live for the kingdom of God and do our job every day and keep this thing from going off the rails entirely. And I think that denial, like sort of the cognitive dissonance or the denial, that's about finding ways to tell yourself a story that prevent you from seeing who's paying the actual price or who's bearing the consequences of someone else's sins, rather than holding that person responsible, or rather than removing yourself from the equation in a way that no longer enables them. And so part of the grief is that, there's so many aspects to it, but part of the grief is opening your eyes to what those consequences are. Like, where's the pain, letting it in and naming it, naming your own responsibility for it as someone who's either committed the sins or enabled them or looked the other way. And in a sense, like, I think, like, this will sound funny. Like, this will be the one quote that comes away from this and haunt me forever. But like, there is a sense in which, like, a lot more Christian leaders in unhealthy organizations should lose hope a lot faster. And I think, I think what often happens is we're taught to be hopeful and optimistic, and we're all Christians, and we ought to be able to gather in the room together and air these things out and reconcile over this stuff. And in reality, like, again, someone who wants to take advantage of that can take advantage of that for a very, very, very long time. Particularly if they're charismatic, particularly if they know how to create a compelling and fun environment. Yeah, you can get everybody together and you can create a situation in which everybody feels better for a time. And 5 minutes later, the consequences continue.
Yeah. Could you talk about a hope that is not rooted in reality?
Right.
Right. And you say that disillusionment is the great nostalgia killer, I think is the way you put it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I don't think of nostalgia. I don't usually think of nostalgia as being especially dangerous. I like the Andy Griffith Show.
Yeah.
And I think you may have already answered this question, but what's so bad about nostalgia?
Yeah, I mean, the word nostalgia is a fun word when you kind of look at the origins of it and what it means. I mean, it literally it has some sort of literal. The etymology is like literally in something like homesickness.
Yeah.
And which is interesting. There's a great episode of Mad Men where when it has one of these legendary Don Draper moments, and he's giving this presentation on the Kodak carousel, and
that's one of the few episodes I've seen. Yeah,
he talks about nostalgia, and he defines it as pain from an old wound. And I mean, it's a devastating scene. It's beautifully done, and so when I was writing the book, I went to kind of look that up and verify and get the details on it. Not actually what it actually means. It means something much more like homesickness.
Yeah.
And
the Odyssey is a nostos, a story of a return home.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, by the way, home's not what it was when Ulysses left, right?
Exactly. And so that to me is what's so interesting about nostalgia is that the nature of homesickness in that sense is that you're longing for something that never was, or you're longing for something that's no longer there. And I think that's part of these disillusionment stories as well. We tend to remember when we're thinking back 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, like we tend to remember inflection points. We don't remember everything. So we've forgotten the things that were bad. We've forgotten the ways that, some people look back on their ministry experience and say, man, 20 years ago, it was just so great. But there's probably somebody who could remind you of a conversation where you were burned out and wanted to quit then too,
Yeah.
And you're forgetting challenges your family faced or financial challenges you had or whatever it was. Like we tend to look at those things in rose-colored ways. And so what I love about the concept of nostalgia is that just the idea of homesickness, the idea that there's something distorted about memory, there's something distorted about the distance of time, where we forget we forget some of the problems, and in doing that, we fool ourselves into thinking, it's that temptation to go back, right? Yeah. If we could just get back to these certain things, if we could just have that one conversation, you can make things right again. And reality always disappoints on that front.
I think one of the most shocking sentence in the whole book maybe is you talk about you reach a point where the storyteller in you must die.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, you're talking about that piece that wants to imagine how things could be. That piece of you that wants to imagine how things could be pieced back together. At some point in any grieving process, that storyteller has to die, which hurts my feelings as a host of a podcast about for storytellers. But that's a really remarkable insight, I think. That there's a place where that fiction, specifically a fiction writer in you, has to go away, so that you can again face reality. And I love the insight that cognitive dissonance takes energy, and it's always taking something out of you. This denial that you talk about, or denial or cognitive dissonance, whichever word you prefer, and that drains you of energy. And it drains slowly, but when it's gone, it's gone. And just like was it Hemingway who said you bankruptcy, it happens really slowly and then really fast?
Fitzgerald. Yeah.
Fitzgerald. Yeah.
How'd you go bankrupt? Slowly, then quickly.
Yeah.
It's a great line.
Yeah. But your talk about the energy that cognitive dissonance requires is a good explanation of what that means, whether going bankrupt slowly and then quickly. Because you think you're hanging on, and then suddenly when the energy's gone, you got nothing left.
Yeah.
Okay, how is all this good news?
Well, because on the other side of it is, I do believe on the other side of it is something better. I mean, to speak to exactly what you were talking about, one of the ways I address it in the book is I look at the story of Elijah in particular.
Yeah.
Look at the story of Peter and Elijah, and both of those. Part of what I was trying to do with that, as a writer, is to say, like, here's this character who's on this journey, and he's got this heroic figure that's shown up in his story. But so the idea is that, like, if we actually paid attention to Peter's story, we'd see that this experience of disillusionment and disorientation and everything is a very normal part of our life.
Yeah.
But we often don't see it. And actually, Peter kind of has a mirror of that in his own life, and that he's got this character Elijah that's, comes up again and again in his story, and he shows up at the Transfiguration. And but Elijah's own story is a story of dramatic, we can call it ministry success if we want, and then dramatic disillusionment and loss.
Yeah.
And what I love about Elijah's story, and I think this connects to this idea of the death of the storyteller. What I love is that, when he reaches that point where he says, "I'm done," and he goes and lays down under the broom tree and hopes for death. There's this long period where God just attends to his body, and he feeds him and he tells him to sleep, and then he sends him on a journey through the desert. He doesn't really give him anything yet. Like, he just sends him on this long journey. And if you look at the map, like, it's a pretty long solo journey to Sinai from where he was. And then when he arrives at Sinai and God speaks, his question is, what are you doing here? And it's a mirror of a question that God often asks. What do you want? Like, what are you? It's that heart, that Augustinian heart question. Yeah. And so what Elijah does is he tells his story, and he's like, look at everything I did and I failed. Right. And he kind of indicts God in it as well. Like, I did all these things and I failed, and clearly you failed, because they're still out there. And God's response to him is to say, yeah, there's a few thousand people you don't even know about. Yeah. There's work that I've done that you know nothing about, that you haven't prepared for, because that's not your story. That's my story. And then God invites him back into God's story. And Elijah plays a very different role. And he's not the hero. He literally goes to pass on his mantle to someone else from there, to give his life away to someone else from there. And something similar happens with Peter when where at the other side of Peter's disillusionment and loss, God invites him into another story, a different story in which he's not the center of the action. Yeah. So that's where I think, like, the good news of that is that, it's so many of the stories in the Bible are these stories of deep humiliation. I mean, again, read God's speech to Job. Like, it is a humiliating speech. And yet on the other side of it, Job is satisfied with it. And it's a restoration of its own. There's something about getting lost in the story of God and in the presence of God. And I think I think that's the key, like that communion with God that we get from sort of letting go of our own, call it transactional, call it narcissistic, call it whatever you will, letting go of those things and being caught up in his story with a lot of uncertainty about what comes next and what's going to happen to us. In fact, with Peter, there's the promise of, you're going to be bound and taken to places you don't want to go, like you're going to suffer. There's something good about that. I think seeing the goodness in that and feeling the goodness in that is something that can only come on the other side of that despair and that loss.
And reality is really the only place we can be happy or have a meaningful life. Yeah, that's so good. All right, let me. It's time for us to wrap up, but I do want to know, who are the writers who make you want to write, Mike?
Man, great question. So So maybe this is hacky. I don't know. Like you can condemn me if this is hacky, but um, the writer who, like, to this day, and I know he's not the greatest writer that ever lived, but the writer to this day that still just gives me a lot of joy and makes me want to write is still Jack Kerouac.
Yeah.
I picked up On the Road. I was 15. Somebody, some friend of mine handed me that book. I read it in one night. And to this day, I could sit down and pick up that book or Visions of Cody or The Vanity of Doulos, and I could just devour them in a couple hours. I love those books.
I think you may be the first person of my 200-something guests who's cited Jack Kerouac as a person. That's great. I love it.
Yeah, I love him. And then kind of on the, on a very different tack, I would say my other favorite writers, one or two of them would be Salman Rushdie, who I think is far more attentive to craft and very meticulous in his process. And the essays of David Foster Wallace. I mean, I could read Wallace essays all day as well. And those are kind of meandering as too. He, but much more intentionally meandering than Kerouac, who would just take a bottle of benzenes and write all night long. So yeah.
Well, Mike Cosper, thanks so much for being here. What a great talk, and I love your book, and I hope a lot of people read it.
Hey, this is a great conversation. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.